Let's be honest, it's always fun to see people suffer, especially when it's done in the name of a higher power. The plagues of Egypt were no different. Each one was carefully designed by God himself to inflict maximum damage on the Egyptians. And they're false. God's while leaving the Israelites unscathed. From frogs to blood, fire, and hail, there's no shortage of weird stuff going on in this ancient tale. Like seriously, they were everywhere. It was like a never-ending game of leapfrog. But nah, he was still not convinced that Moses was the one true prophet. So God decided to turn up the heat with a plague of lice. Not the most terrifying thing on this list, but trust us, it was pretty awful back then. See, lice were a sign of uncleanliness and death, and the fact that they infested the Egyptians' clothes and hair made it worse. Oh no, it's Now boyos aren't the worst thing ever, but back then they were pretty painful and pretty deadly. They could grow huge, fill with pus, and even lead to eye and brain infections. I'm talking about a full-on boil. So why did God send them? Well, boils were a sign of uncleanliness and disease. Imagine you're an ancient Egyptian, living in a land where the sun god Ra rules supreme, when suddenly darkness falls over the country and lasts for 3 days. What the heck is going on? Is it the end of the world? Well, in a way it kind of is. This isn't just any old darkness. It is a divine punishment sent by God to humble the Egyptians and show them that their beliefs are wrong. The darkness wasn't just psychological either. It was a physical manifestation of God's power. He literally plunged the country into darkness to show them that he was in control. Not Ra, but it wasn't just a display of power. It was also a way to weaken the Egyptians. Without the sun's life-giving rays, plants withered, animals panicked, and people lost hope. It was a full-on breakdown of their society and a sign that things were about to change. And the Egyptians were definitely not clean. They worked in harsh conditions, ate contaminated food, and lived in crowded cities. After all the previous plagues, you'd think they'd be begging for mercy, but instead of repenting, they only doubled down on their denial. As we all know, the consequences were dire, to say the least. But hey, at least we got a pretty wild story out of it. So what do you think? Did we miss anything? Let us know in the comments below. And do you and T forget to like and subscribe for more epic tales from history's greatest storytellers? But nope. They were still not convinced that Moses was the one true prophet. So God unleashed his deadliest weapon yet, the death of the firstborn. This wasn't just a few kids who kicked the bucket. Every firstborn son in Egypt died, from pharaohs to peasants. It was a full-on massacre. But why take out the firstborns? Well, it was a way to strike at the heart of Egyptian society. The firstborn sons were considered the future leaders and protectors of Egypt. By killing them, God was weakening the country for the future. But it was also a final warning for the Egyptians to listen to Moses and escape the wrath of God. Sadly, they didn't get the hint and suffered the ultimate consequence. So it was only a matter of time before something bad happened. But boils weren't just painful and deadly. They were also a symbol of the Egyptians, just like the other plagues. It was a way for God to show them that they messed up and needed to change their ways. I mean, who wants to wear a hat that's crawling with bugs? Yuck. Then, bam. Hail the size of a horse's tooth comes crashing down and destroys everything in sight. Talk about a major buzzkill. But why did God send such a powerful storm? Well, hailstorms were rare in Egypt, so it was a sign of God's power and a warning for the Egyptians to change their ways. The hail also targeted the Egyptian economy and way of life. Crops were destroyed, livestock was killed, and people's homes were damaged, leaving them with nothing to eat or wear. It was a full-on disaster, but it wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a divine punishment for the Egyptians' stubbornness. But it wasn't just gross, it was also a punishment for the Egyptians' stubbornness. Not only are they gross, but they also eat everything in sight, leaving you with nothing to eat or sell. That is exactly what happened in Egypt when God sent a plague of locusts to punish the Egyptians for their sin. These weren't your average insects. They were huge, fast, and extremely hungry. They devoured everything in sight and left nothing but destruction in their wake. But it wasn't just the Egyptians' food supply that was at risk. Their entire economy was in danger. If they couldn't grow or harvest crops, they wouldn't have any money or power. It was a full-on attack on their way of life. And the scariest part, locusts were considered a good omen in ancient Egypt. So you can imagine how messed up it was when they became a plague. God was basically saying, you won't listen to me, so I'll make your lives really uncomfortable until you do. And let's be real, dealing with lice is torture. They itch like crazy and they're almost impossible to get rid of. So yeah, this plague was a pretty effective way of showing the Egyptians that they messed up. You'd think that after the whole water tube blood incident, Pharaoh would be like, okay, maybe we messed up. Flies are already annoying, but when they infest an entire country, things can get real nasty. They were huge and infested every part of the Egyptians' lives. I'm talking about a full-on flipacalypse. So why flies? Well, they represented death and decay. Plus, they carried diseases that could kill humans, which made them even more creepy. But they also targeted the Egyptians' economy and way of life. Flies would contaminate food and make it unsafe to eat, leading to starvation and sickness. They also made it impossible for the Egyptians to work or travel without being bitten and harassed. So yeah, this plague was a major buzzkill for the Egyptians. But nope, he still wasn't convinced that God was the real deal. So God decided to dial up the weirdness factor with an infestation of frogs. That is exactly what happened in Egypt when God sent a pestilence to punish the Egyptians for their stubbornness. This wasn't your average flu. It was a full-on disease outbreak that killed humans and animals alike. I'm talking about a real-life nightmare, but why target the Egyptians? Well, it was a punishment for their refusal to listen to God. Despite all the previous plagues, they still didn't believe in Moses or his message. So God sent them a wake-up call that said, hey, you guys need to shape up. Unfortunately, the Egyptians didn't get the memo, and the plague went on for 7 days, killing even more people. It was a sad but necessary reminder that life is precious, and we shouldn't waste it ignoring the divine. These weren't your average amphibians. They were massive, slimy, and super creepy. Talk about an amphibian apocalypse. But why frogs? Well, these little guys were sacred to the Egyptians, so seeing them turn into these huge, gross monsters was pretty messed up. It was like God was saying, hey, you think you're so smart, right? Well, here's a little special treat for you. But frogs weren't just gross. They were also a symbol of decay and death. Their slimy bodies represented the corruption that had spread throughout Egypt, and their croaking filled the streets day and night, reminding everyone of the coming judgment. Plus, let's be real, who wants to go to work when there's a frog literally sitting on your head? So let's take a closer look at each plague and uncover its hidden meaning. Number 1. Water turned to blood. You may have seen a certain someone turning water into wine, but in ancient Egypt, the stakes were much higher. When Moses and Aaron confronted Pharaoh, they warned him that God would punish the Egyptians for their stubbornness. And boy, did he deliver. With a flick of his staff, the Nile River turned a deep crimson color. Yikes. But why, you ask? Well, the river's dark hue symbolized the blood of the Egyptian people who would soon face judgment. Plus, it also targeted their source of fresh water, making life pretty tough. But this wasn't just some magic trick. It was a serious message from God. After all, the Nile was sacred to the Egyptians, and they believed it was home to many gods. By turning it to blood, Moses showed them that their beliefs were wrong and their gods weren't real. In fact, it was a clear sign that only the true God was in charge. This wasn't just about scaring the pants off the Egyptians. It was also about humbling them and showing them that they could rely on their own strength or cleverness. The water-to-blood incident was a wake-up call for the Egyptians to recognize their wrongdoing and turn to God before it was too late. Unfortunately, they didn't take the hint, and things got real ugly after that. No. 2. Frogs. Imagine you're an ancient Egyptian, minding your own business, when suddenly you're bombarded with millions of frogs. 3. Lice. After the great frog fiasco, you'd think Pharaoh had learned his lesson. 4. Flies. Well, the last plague was a pain in the, well, you know, this one was a full-on assault on the senses. 5. Pestilence. Let's be honest, nobody likes getting sick. But when a plague hits, things can get real ugly. 6. Boils. Imagine you're an ancient Egyptian slave, working hard for the pharaoh, when suddenly you feel a burning sensation on your skin. 7. Hail. Imagine you're an ancient Egyptian farmer, working hard to grow crops for your family and community, when suddenly the sky turns dark and stormy. 8. Locusts. Imagine you're an ancient Egyptian, looking out over your fields when suddenly you see a swarm of locusts descending upon your crops. Yikes. The 9th plague of Egypt, known as darkness, enveloped the land for 3 days, leaving everyone in fear and despair. 10. Death of the firstborn. This was the final straw for the Egyptians. Each plague served as a wake-up call for the Egyptians to turn away from their false gods and embrace the true God.